The abbey stood so quietly among the mountains that many travelers passed within a mile of it without ever realizing it was there. Hidden behind ancient cedar trees and sheltered by a steep hillside, St. Aldwyn's Abbey had watched over the northern valleys for more than 300 years. Its pale gray stone walls blended naturally with the cliffs behind them, while its slate roof disappeared beneath moss and wild ivy that had slowly claimed it over the centuries. There were no grand towers, no richly decorated gates, no banners flying proudly in the wind. Compared with the great monasteries near the capital, St. Aldwyn's looked almost humble, and perhaps that was exactly how its builders intended it. The monks who lived there believed that quiet places allowed people to hear not only the world around them, but also themselves. Each morning before sunrise, while the valley still rested beneath a blanket of darkness, a single sound drifted through the mountains: the Abbey bell. It rang only once, never twice, never hurried. One clear note echoed across the forests before slowly fading into the morning mist. To nearby villagers, the bell marked the beginning of another ordinary day. Farmers rose from bed, bakers lit their ovens, shepherds prepared their flocks. Children stirred beneath warm blankets as smoke began rising from stone chimneys. The sound had become part of life itself. Few people questioned it. After all, the bell had rung every dawn for as long as anyone could remember. Brother Matthew had lived at St. Aldwyn's Abbey for only 6 months. At 24 years old, he was the youngest monk in the community. Unlike many of the older brothers who entered the monastery as children, Matthew had spent much of his youth traveling with his father, a merchant who crossed mountain roads carrying cloth, salt, and olive oil between distant towns. Those journeys filled him with curiosity. He loved asking questions. How old was this bridge? Who built that road? Why did one village celebrate different festivals than the next? The older monks often smiled at his endless curiosity. Brother Cedric, the Abbey librarian, once joked, "If questions were candles, you'd light the entire mountain." Matthew simply laughed. "I hope I never run out."
The bell rang at precisely the same moment the next morning. One clear note drifted across the valley before the first hint of sunlight touched the mountain peaks. It was neither loud nor soft. It carried with remarkable balance, as though the cold morning air itself had learned to protect the sound. Brother Matthew was already awake. This time, he had been awake for nearly an hour. Wrapped in a thick wool cloak, he stood in the narrow corridor beneath the bell tower, watching the worn stone staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. He had lit no lantern. He wanted his eyes to adjust naturally to the dim light filtering through the small windows. The monastery remained completely silent. No footsteps, no voices, not even the creaking of old wooden doors. Then, the bell rang. Matthew instinctively looked toward the staircase, still empty. Only after the sound faded did he hear footsteps approaching from the opposite hallway. Brother Thomas appeared carrying his usual lantern. He smiled warmly. "You've started waking earlier than I do." Matthew smiled back, though his thoughts were elsewhere. "It seems I have." Thomas continued climbing toward the tower without another word. Matthew waited. He counted quietly to 20 before following. The staircase was older than the rest of the abbey. Its steps had been worn smooth by centuries of sandals and boots. Some stones dipped slightly in the middle, where thousands upon thousands of footsteps had passed over them. The higher Matthew climbed, the colder the air became. Finally, he reached the bell chamber. Brother Thomas stood beside the great bronze bell, carefully checking the thick hemp rope that hung from the wooden beams above. He looked surprised. "I didn't know you were behind me." "I wanted to see the tower." Thomas nodded. "It doesn't receive many visitors." Matthew slowly walked around the room. The chamber was simple, very simple. 4 narrow windows overlooked the valley. Heavy oak beams supported the roof. The great bell hung motionless above them. Nothing seemed unusual, nothing at all. "May I ask you something?" Thomas smiled. "Of course." "Who rang the bell this morning?" Thomas looked at him with mild confusion. "I did." Matthew hesitated. "I was downstairs. I never saw anyone climb the stairs." The older monk remained silent for several moments. Finally, he rested one hand against the bell. "My friend, I've rung this bell for 32 years. I've never once wondered who rang it before me." Matthew blinked. "What do you mean?" Thomas gave only a gentle smile. "Some traditions become larger than the people who continue them." He said nothing more. That afternoon, heavy clouds settled over the mountains. Rain replaced snow for the first time in weeks. Water dripped steadily from the Abbey roofs while the brothers worked quietly indoors. Brother Cedric invited Matthew into the library. "I have something you may find interesting." From the highest shelf, the elderly librarian carefully removed a thick leather-bound volume. Dust rose gently as he placed it upon the reading table. The Founding Chronicle. Matthew had heard of it many times. Few monks ever read it. The book recorded the earliest years of St. Aldwyn's Abbey. Brother Cedric slowly opened the fragile pages. The handwriting was nearly impossible to mistake. Large, elegant, patient, written by hands that expected their words to outlive them. For several hours, they read together. The first chapters described the Abbey's construction, stone by stone, wall by wall. Local villagers had worked alongside monks, carrying limestone from nearby quarries and cedar beams from the surrounding forests. It had taken nearly 15 years to complete the buildings. Matthew smiled. "I've always wondered how they built the bell tower." Cedric quietly turned another page. So did I. The chapter describing the tower finally appeared. Matthew leaned closer. The tower was completed during the Abbey's 12th year. Workers celebrated with a simple feast. A bronze bell arrived from a foundry 2 valleys away. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, until the final sentence. Brother Cedric read it aloud. "The morning before the bell was lifted into the tower, we heard it ring for the first time." Matthew looked up immediately. "That's impossible." Cedric closed the book gently. "I agree." Neither man spoke for a long while. Outside, rain tapped softly against the library windows. Matthew finally broke the silence. Could it be a mistake? It could. A story added later? Also possible. But look, Cedric carefully pointed toward the ink. The writing matched every other page. Same hand, same age, no sign of alteration. If someone had invented the story, they had done so more than 3 centuries earlier. That evening, Matthew walked alone through the monastery gardens. Rain had stopped. Mist drifted lazily between the cedar trees, while small drops of water clung to every leaf. Near the old stone wall, he noticed Brother Gabriel trimming vines. Gabriel was the oldest monk at St. Aldwyn's Abbey. No one knew his exact age. Some guessed 70, others believed he had already passed 80. Matthew greeted him politely. "Good evening." "And to you." They worked quietly for a few minutes, before Matthew finally asked, "May I ask you about the bell?" The old monk smiled without looking up. "I wondered when you would. You've noticed me asking questions. My son, I noticed your questions before you spoke them." Matthew laughed softly. "Then perhaps you already know the answer." The old monk shook his head. "No, but I know where not to look." Matthew frowned. "What does that mean?" Gabriel gently placed his pruning knife aside. "Most people climb the tower. They watch the rope. They examine the bell. They search the walls. And they're looking in the wrong place." Matthew felt his curiosity grow even stronger. If not the tower, then where? Gabriel slowly looked toward the old cemetery behind the chapel. Weathered stone crosses stood quietly beneath towering cedar trees. "The bell has always belonged to the Abbey." He paused. "But the Abbey has not always belonged to the bell." Without another word, the old monk picked up his basket and quietly walked back toward the monastery. Matthew remained standing alone in the vines. His eyes slowly followed Gabriel's gaze toward the ancient cemetery. For the first time, he wondered whether the answer to the mystery had never been above the monastery at all, but beneath it.
The cemetery behind St. Aldwyn's Abbey was unlike any Brother Matthew had ever seen. It was not large. Perhaps 60 graves rested beneath the ancient cedar trees, their weathered stone markers leaning gently after centuries of wind, rain, and winter snow. Wildflowers grew freely between them during spring. In winter, soft blankets of snow covered every name equally. The oldest graves had become almost impossible to read. Time had slowly erased the letters one season at a time. Only the silence remained. Matthew had walked past the cemetery dozens of times. He had never truly looked at it. The following morning, after finishing his work in the library, he carried a small brush and a bucket of clean water toward the oldest section of the graveyard. His reason was simple enough. Many of the stone markers were covered with moss. Cleaning them was useful work. No one questioned why he volunteered. Brother Gabriel watched from the herb garden nearby. He offered only a small smile, nothing more. Matthew began with the graves nearest the chapel. Most belonged to abbots who had led the monastery through difficult winters, poor harvests, and peaceful decades alike. Each stone carried little more than a name, a year, a simple prayer, nothing unusual. He continued farther beneath the cedar trees. Here the graves became older, the carvings rougher. Some stones had cracked completely. Others leaned so heavily that tree roots seemed to be holding them upright. After nearly an hour, Matthew reached the oldest marker in the cemetery. Unlike the others, it carried no name, only a carved bell, nothing else. He knelt beside it. The carving had almost disappeared beneath centuries of moss. Carefully brushing away the green layer, he noticed something unexpected. Tiny letters curved beneath the bell, so worn they could barely be seen. He leaned closer. "The first listener." Matthew quietly repeated the words. "The first listener." Not the first abbot, not the first bellkeeper, the first listener. That afternoon, he searched the Abbey records. Surely someone had written about the unusual grave. Yet after hours of reading burial registers, monastery accounts, and old chronicles, he found nothing. Every abbot was listed, every monk who had died within the Abbey walls, every servant buried in the cemetery, except one, the grave with the bell. It simply did not exist. Brother Cedric noticed Matthew surrounded by piles of manuscripts. "Still chasing mysteries?" Matthew smiled. "I found a grave." Cedric nodded. "There are many. One without a name." The librarian stopped arranging books. "Describe it." Matthew told him about the carved bell, the words, the missing records. Cedric remained unusually quiet. Finally, he walked toward one of the oldest cabinets in the library. Hidden behind several larger books rested a narrow wooden box. Its hinges squeaked softly as he opened it. Inside lay dozens of loose sheets written by different hands across many generations. "These aren't official records," Cedric explained. "They're notes, observations, things monks noticed but never fully understood." Matthew carefully picked up the first page. Some described strange weather. Others recorded unusually bright comets or rare eclipses. Then one short entry caught his eye. Brother Anselm reported hearing the bell while repairing the cemetery wall. The tower remained empty. The note had been written 211 years earlier. Matthew searched the remaining pages. Again and again, different monks had reported nearly identical experiences, always the same. The bell rang, the tower stood empty, someone investigated. No explanation followed. Yet none of the notes sounded frightened. No one described miracles. No one claimed ghosts haunted the monastery. Instead, the writers simply accepted that something they could not explain had happened, then continued living their ordinary lives. Matthew found that strangely comforting. That evening, thick fog rolled into the valley. It wrapped itself around the monastery until the bell tower disappeared completely from view. Even familiar paths became difficult to see. After supper, Brother Gabriel invited Matthew for a short walk. Neither man carried a lantern. "The moon is enough tonight," he said. They slowly wandered among the cedar trees. The fog muffled every sound. Even their footsteps seemed quieter. Finally, Gabriel stopped beside the oldest grave. "The one you found?" Matthew nodded. "Who was the first listener?" The old monk smiled gently. "I don't know." "You don't? I've lived here nearly 50 years. I've asked the same question." "And?" No answer. Matthew was surprised. "You never searched further?" Gabriel laughed softly. "When I was your age, I searched everywhere. The tower, the crypt, the archives, the hills. I even questioned travelers. What did you discover?" "Only this." He rested one hand upon the nameless stone. "Some mysteries survive because people stop trying to own them." As they turned to leave, Matthew noticed something unusual. The fog had begun thinning around the oldest cedar tree. There, half hidden beneath tangled roots, something made of stone protruded from the earth. At first, he assumed it was another broken grave marker. Then he brushed away damp leaves. It wasn't a gravestone. It was a carved pillar, small, round, older than every grave surrounding it. Its surface carried no cross, no name, only a beautifully carved circle of tiny bells, 12 of them, arranged around a single star. Matthew called quietly, "Brother Gabriel." The old monk returned. His expression changed the moment he saw the pillar. "I've walked past this tree thousands of times. So have I. Have you ever seen this?" Gabriel slowly shook his head. "No." Together, they carefully cleared away more leaves. More of the pillar emerged from the earth. It continued downward much farther than either expected, almost as if it wasn't a monument at all. It was only the very top of something buried beneath the monastery long before St. Aldwyn's Abbey had ever been laid. Far above them, hidden inside the thick evening fog, the bell rang once. Neither man had seen anyone enter the tower. Neither had heard footsteps. They simply stood in silence as the familiar note drifted gently across the mountains. For the first time, Matthew began wondering if the mystery of the bell had not started with the Abbey, but with whatever had stood on that hillside centuries before the first stone of St. Aldwyn's was ever laid. Long before sunrise the next morning, Brother Matthew returned to the old cedar tree. He carried only a small lantern, a wooden spade, and a quiet determination that had grown stronger with every passing day. The monastery still slept. Only the wind moved through the branches overhead. He knelt beside the stone pillar and gently brushed away another layer of damp earth. The carved bells became even clearer in the lantern light. There were 12 of them, each one slightly different. Some were large, some were small. None of them matched the great bronze bell hanging inside the Abbey tower. Whoever had carved them paid extraordinary attention to detail. This had not been decoration. It had meant something. A familiar voice spoke softly behind him. "I thought I'd find you here." Matthew turned. Brother Gabriel stood smiling beneath his hood. "You should be asleep. So should you." The old monk laughed quietly. Curiosity is difficult to ignore. Matthew nodded toward the pillar. "I want to know what's beneath it." Gabriel looked at the ground for several moments before answering. "Then let's find out." The two monks worked slowly, not because the soil was hard, because they wanted to disturb as little as possible. Hour after hour, they removed loose earth and tangled roots. As daylight gradually filled the valley, more of the buried stone appeared. It wasn't simply a pillar. It was the corner of something much larger, a carefully carved circle of pale limestone, perfectly smooth despite its age. Matthew carefully measured the curve with a length of rope. His eyes widened. "It's round." Gabriel nodded. "A foundation. But for what?" Neither man knew. By mid-morning, Brother Cedric joined them carrying old sketches copied from the Abbey archives. I thought these might help. Most showed the monastery exactly as it appeared today. One drawing, however, immediately caught Matthew's attention. It had been copied nearly 200 years earlier. Behind the Abbey, exactly where the cedar tree now stood, the artist had drawn a small circular structure. No explanation, no label, just a circle. Matthew looked at Cedric. "Why has no one mentioned this before?" Cedric smiled gently. "Because no one asked." The three monks continued comparing old records. Late that afternoon, Cedric found something unusual tucked inside a weathered manuscript. It wasn't part of the original book. It had been folded between 2 pages long ago, a loose sheet, barely larger than a hand. Across the top, someone had written, "For those who listen after us." Matthew unfolded it carefully. The handwriting differed from every document he had seen before. Older, much older. The message was short. "Do not build over the circle unless you promise never to silence the morning bell." No name, no date, only those words. Brother Gabriel slowly sat upon a nearby stone. "I've lived here nearly half a century. I believed the monastery was the oldest place on this hill." Matthew quietly shook his head. "I don't think it is." Cedric looked toward the buried foundation. Perhaps the Abbey wasn't the beginning. Perhaps it was built to protect something already here. That evening, the abbot himself requested to see the discovery. Abbot Nicholas rarely involved himself in old mysteries. He preferred gardens, prayer, and practical matters, but after examining the buried circle, he remained unusually thoughtful. Finally, he spoke. "When I became abbot, my predecessor told me one sentence." He paused. "I never understood it." Matthew waited. Nicholas looked toward the bell tower. He said,
Never ask why the bell rings. Silence settled around them. I assumed he meant faith, Nicholas admitted. Now I'm not so certain. The following morning, the brothers carefully cleared the remainder of the circular foundation. By midday, its full shape finally emerged. It measured nearly 20 feet across, perfectly round. At its exact center rested a flat stone unlike any other, smooth white limestone, polished until it almost reflected sunlight. Around its edge, 12 tiny bells were carved on the surface, exactly matching the design on the pillar. Matthew slowly stepped closer. Something about the stone felt strangely peaceful, not mysterious, not frightening, simply quiet. As he brushed away centuries of dust from its center, faint letters gradually appeared, written in elegant Latin. Brother Cedric translated aloud. "When voices fade, let one sound remain." No one spoke. The sentence lingered in the cool mountain air. Brother Gabriel finally whispered, "Perhaps this place was never meant to call people together." Matthew looked at him. "What do you mean?" The old monk rested his hand gently upon the ancient stone. "I think," he said, "it was built to help people remember." That night, a violent storm swept across the mountains. Rain lashed against the monastery walls. Powerful winds bent the cedar trees until their branches nearly touched the ground. Lightning flashed across the valley again and again. The brothers remained awake, fearing the old bell tower might suffer damage. Then, just before dawn, the storm suddenly stopped. An impossible stillness settled over the mountain. Without anyone climbing the tower, without anyone touching the rope, the great bell rang, not once, but twice. Every monk inside St. Aldwyn's Abbey froze where he stood. Even Brother Thomas, who had cared for the bell for 32 years, slowly looked toward the tower with an expression Matthew had never seen before. Quiet astonishment. Because in all those years, the morning bell had never, ever rung twice.
The second bell changed everything. Not because it frightened the monks. It didn't. St. Aldwyn's Abbey had stood peacefully for centuries, and nothing about the sound felt threatening. The surprise came from its certainty. Every living monk knew the same tradition. The morning bell rang once, always once, never more. Yet every brother in the monastery had heard the second note. No one imagined it. No one questioned whether it had happened. The silence that followed felt deeper than any conversation. After breakfast, the abbot gathered the entire community inside the chapter house. Sunlight streamed softly through narrow stained glass windows, painting gentle colors across the old stone floor. Abbot Nicholas looked around the room before speaking. "I have lived within these walls for 41 years. I have heard the morning bell more than 15,000 times. A few quiet smiles appeared. Until today, it has never rung twice." No one interrupted him. "If anyone has an explanation, I would gladly hear it." The room remained completely silent. Finally, Brother Thomas stood. His hands were rough from decades of climbing the bell tower. "I inspected the bell. The rope? Perfect. The wooden frame? Strong. The bronze? No cracks." He hesitated. "I found nothing unusual." Matthew quietly asked, "Did anyone enter the tower during the night?" Thomas shook his head. The staircase still carried yesterday's dust. There were no fresh footprints. Later that afternoon, Brother Cedric unlocked a small room beside the library that Matthew had never entered before. "This," he said with a smile, "is where we keep the books no one remembers." Inside were shelves filled with forgotten manuscripts. Some had never been catalogued, others lacked titles altogether. Dust floated lazily through narrow beams of afternoon light. Matthew immediately felt at home. Hours passed as the two monks carefully opened fragile volumes one after another. Most contained sermons, prayer books, lists of donations from nearby villages. Nothing connected to the mysterious bell. Then, near sunset, Cedric pulled out a thin leather notebook no larger than his hand. There. Matthew leaned closer. Across the first page, someone had written, "Observations never explained." Unlike the official chronicles, these pages contained small mysteries that generations of monks had quietly recorded. One entry described lights moving through the forest during a harsh winter. Another mentioned birds arriving weeks before spring. None of the writers claimed miracles. They simply wrote what they had seen. Matthew continued reading. Then, one page stopped him. Year 1318. The bell rang twice before dawn. His heart skipped. There was more. The brothers gathered in confusion. 3 days later, 12 travelers arrived carrying books rescued from a monastery destroyed by fire. Matthew slowly looked up. Cedric? The librarian already understood. The bell rang twice before. Together, they searched the notebook. Several decades later, another entry. The bell sounded again twice. Before winter ended, refugees reached the Abbey seeking shelter after their village flooded. Then, another. The second bell returned. Within the week, a caravan delivered manuscripts thought lost during the Northern Wars. Matthew stared quietly at the pages. The pattern seemed impossible to ignore. The second bell never warned of danger. It announced arrival. That evening, Matthew shared the notebook with Abbot Nicholas and Brother Gabriel. The old monk smiled thoughtfully. So the bell remembers. Matthew frowned. Remembers what? Gabriel slowly closed the notebook. Those who are still coming. Just before sunset, a young shepherd from the valley arrived at the monastery gates. His clothes were soaked from crossing swollen streams. "I've come with a message." The porter welcomed him inside. The boy removed his cap respectfully. "My grandfather asked me to deliver this." He placed a small cloth bundle onto the table. Inside rested an old iron key. Its surface had turned almost black with age. Attached to it was a faded strip of parchment. Only 5 words remained readable. "Return this to the Abbey." Nothing else. No name. No explanation. The shepherd scratched his head. "My grandfather said his grandfather kept it, and his grandfather before him. They always believed one day someone at St. Aldwyn's Abbey would need it." Brother Matthew carefully lifted the heavy key. It was unlike any key used in the monastery. Its shaft was unusually long. The teeth had been cut into an unfamiliar pattern. Brother Thomas examined it. "It doesn't belong to any door I've ever seen." Brother Cedric quietly whispered, "Perhaps because the door no longer exists." That night, Matthew couldn't sleep. The strange key rested on the table beside his bed. Moonlight slipped quietly through the narrow window. He found himself turning the key over and over in his hands. Then he noticed something. Near the handle, almost hidden beneath rust, someone had engraved a tiny symbol. Not a cross, not a bell. A circle, surrounded by 12 small bells. Exactly like the ancient stone buried beneath the cedar tree. Exactly like the carving on the old pillar. Exactly like the forgotten design beneath the monastery itself. Matthew slowly looked toward the window. Outside, the bell tower stood peacefully beneath the moon. The second bell had announced that something was coming. Now, it seemed, that arrival had already begun. And somewhere beneath St. Aldwyn's Abbey, there was almost certainly a lock that had been waiting centuries for exactly this key.
Brother Matthew stared at the letter without moving. For a long moment, no one in the chamber spoke. The small wax seal caught the afternoon sunlight, glowing softly against the old oak table. His own name, written in careful black ink. Not brother, not father, simply Matthew. It looked as though the ink had dried only yesterday. Brother Thomas quietly cleared his throat. "You should open it." Matthew didn't reach for it. "I don't understand." "Neither do we," Abbot Nicholas replied gently. "But sometimes understanding comes after the first step." With slow, careful hands, Matthew broke the wax seal. The room remained silent except for the soft crackle of old parchment. Inside was a single folded page. The handwriting looked remarkably familiar. Not because Matthew had seen it before, because it matched the handwriting in the earliest Abbey chronicles. Elegant, patient, steady. He began reading aloud. "To the one who arrives with questions before answers." Matthew stopped. Everyone exchanged quiet glances. He continued, "If this letter has reached your hands, then the bell has already rung twice." Brother Gabriel slowly closed his eyes, exactly as it had. "Do not be surprised. Every keeper before you believed the letter was written for someone else. It never was." Matthew turned the page. The next lines explained more than anyone expected. The bell does not announce miracles. It announces responsibility. Whenever knowledge at risk finds its way back to this hill, the second bell is heard. Brother Cedric whispered, "So the bell wasn't calling us." Matthew nodded slowly. It was welcoming something home. The letter continued. "Centuries ago, before the Abbey existed, travelers built this chamber beneath the mountain. They came from different kingdoms. Some were monks, some were map makers, some were physicians, some were teachers, but all believed the same truth." Matthew read the final sentence carefully. "Knowledge survives only when ordinary people quietly choose to protect it." No king was mentioned, no hidden treasure, no prophecy, only people, ordinary people. Brother Cedric immediately began examining the shelves more carefully. The collection was extraordinary. There were maps of mountain passes that no longer existed, letters written by travelers describing villages lost to earthquakes centuries earlier, medical texts copied from monasteries that had burned long ago, astronomical observations, botanical drawings, even children's lessons carefully preserved on thin sheets of parchment. Matthew smiled softly. "They saved everything." Cedric nodded. They believed every piece of knowledge mattered. While the others organized the books, Brother Thomas noticed something carved beneath the round table. He knelt and brushed away a thin layer of dust. Another inscription, this one much shorter. "The bell is not the guardian, the listener is." Thomas looked toward Matthew. "I think I finally understand your grave." "The first listener." Matthew slowly nodded. The title wasn't about hearing, it was about paying attention.
As evening approached, the brothers carefully carried only a few books back to the Abbey library. They agreed the hidden chamber should remain exactly as they had found it. No crowds, no announcements, no excitement, only careful preservation. Abbot Nicholas spoke quietly as they climbed the stone passage. Some places become important because people visit them. He smiled. This place became important because people left it alone. That night, the Abbey felt different. Not mysterious, peaceful. Matthew walked alone through the cloister garden beneath a sky filled with stars. The familiar bell tower stood quietly above the rooftops. For the first time since arriving at St. Aldwyn's Abbey, he no longer wondered who rang the morning bell. Perhaps that was never the real mystery. Just before dawn, Matthew was already awake. He stood outside beneath the cool morning sky. The valley remained covered in silver mist. Everything was still. Then the bell rang. One clear note, exactly as always. Matthew smiled softly. Only one. The second bell had disappeared. Its work was finished. Later that morning, an elderly traveler arrived at the monastery carrying a worn leather satchel. He introduced himself simply. "My name is Elias." Matthew recognized him immediately, the old mapmaker who had visited months earlier. Elias looked around the peaceful courtyard before asking, "Did the bell ring twice?" Matthew hesitated. "How did you know?" The old man smiled gently. "My grandfather heard it once. My father heard it once. I heard it once as a young man." Matthew looked puzzled. "But they never came here." "No, they only knew what the second bell meant." "And what does it mean?" Elias looked toward the bell tower, where morning sunlight now warmed the ancient stone. "It means the Abbey has accepted another keeper." Matthew laughed softly. "I don't feel like a keeper." The old mapmaker smiled gently. Neither did any of the others. Before leaving, Elias handed Matthew a small cloth bundle. Inside rested an old brass compass. Its needle still moved perfectly despite its age. On the back, someone had engraved a single sentence: "When roads disappear, memory becomes the map." Matthew quietly slipped the compass into his pocket. As he looked up again, Elias had already begun walking down the mountain road. His figure slowly disappeared into the morning mist. Matthew watched until he was completely gone. Then he turned back toward St. Aldwyn's Abbey. The bell tower stood peacefully above the cedar trees. Its single bell waited silently for another dawn, not to summon crowds, not to announce power, but to remind each new generation that some of history's greatest treasures are not made of gold or stone. They are made of stories, carefully remembered and quietly passed from one listener to the next.
The days that followed settled into a peaceful rhythm once again. At sunrise, the bell rang once. The brothers gathered for prayer. Bread baked in the kitchen before dawn. Brother Thomas climbed the tower every morning with the same quiet patience he had shown for decades. To anyone passing through the valley, St. Aldwyn's Abbey looked exactly as it always had. Simple, peaceful, unchanged. Only those who had entered the hidden chamber beneath the hillside knew that the monastery was now carrying a secret far older than its own walls. Brother Matthew spent nearly every afternoon underground with Brother Cedric. They worked slowly, never rushing. Each manuscript was gently cleaned with soft brushes. Loose pages were pressed between smooth wooden boards. Damaged bindings were wrapped in fresh linen rather than replaced. Cedric repeated the same lesson every day. We are not improving history, we're helping it survive. Matthew liked those words. They reminded him that even careful hands could become part of a much longer story. One afternoon, while organizing a shelf of travel journals, Matthew discovered a collection unlike any he had ever seen. The books were remarkably thin, no more than 20 pages each. Each cover carried a single year instead of a title: 1198, 1199, 1200, 1201. Each volume described only one day, nothing more. Matthew opened the first. Today, we welcomed a shepherd carrying the last surviving copy of his village records. The next, today, a widow entrusted us with her husband's maps before the soldiers arrived. Another, today, a teacher brought the names of children whose school had burned. Matthew slowly realized what he was reading. These were not ordinary journals. They recorded the days when knowledge had been rescued. Not wars, not kings, not victories. Only moments when someone had quietly chosen to preserve something that might otherwise have been lost forever. That evening, Matthew asked Brother Cedric, why didn't they write about famous events? Cedric smiled. Because famous events are remembered. He carefully closed another book. The small ones are the ones that disappear. Matthew looked around the hidden chamber. Every shelf suddenly seemed different. It wasn't a room filled with old books. It was a room filled with forgotten acts of kindness. A week later, several villagers arrived carrying baskets of apples, fresh cheese, and woven blankets as gifts for the monastery. Harvest season had begun. Among them was an elderly woman named Anna. She had visited the Abbey every autumn for nearly 40 years. After sharing tea in the courtyard, she quietly approached Brother Matthew. "My grandmother asked me to give you something." From inside her basket, she removed a folded piece of cloth. Inside rested a tiny wooden whistle. Plain, smooth, beautifully carved. Matthew looked puzzled. "What is it?" Anna smiled. "My family has kept it for generations. We were told that if the Abbey ever needed remembering, we should return it." Matthew turned the little whistle over in his hands. Carved into its side was a familiar symbol, a circle, surrounded by 12 tiny bells. His heart skipped. Another object, another family, another promise that had survived across generations. "Did your grandmother tell you anything else?" Anna nodded. "Only one sentence." "What was it?" She smiled softly. "Some things are safest when many people each remember a small part." That night, Matthew carried the whistle into the hidden chamber. Brother Gabriel was already there. The old monk had quietly begun helping preserve the collection. Matthew showed him the carving. He examined it carefully. Then he looked toward the shelves. "I think we've misunderstood something." Matthew frowned. "How?" "We believed this place survived because one monastery protected it." He slowly shook his head. "No, it survived because hundreds of ordinary families each protected one small piece." Matthew suddenly understood. The old key, the map, the whistle, the journals, none of them had been kept together. They had been scattered, each entrusted to different people, so if one was lost,
The others would remain. The following morning, a violent wind swept through the mountains. Dark clouds rolled over the valley. Not long after midday, a frightened young shepherd ran through the Abbey gate. "Brother, my sheep scattered during the storm." Several monks immediately offered to help. Matthew joined them. Together they climbed the western hillside where the sheep had disappeared among the cedar trees. Rain began falling before they reached the ridge. Visibility dropped quickly. The mountain became strangely quiet. Then Matthew heard something. Not the Abbey bell, another bell, much smaller, soft, almost musical. He stopped walking. "Did you hear that?" The shepherd nodded slowly. "It came from over there." They followed the faint sound through the trees. After a few minutes, they reached a narrow stone arch, almost completely hidden beneath ivy. Beyond it stood the crumbling ruins of an older building. Only fragments of walls remained, a broken doorway, pieces of carved columns, and in the center, a small bronze bell hanging from a weathered wooden frame. The wind moved it gently. Its quiet notes drifted through the forest. Matthew stared in amazement. "This place," the shepherd whispered. "I've never seen it before." Neither had Matthew. Yet the architecture looked even older than St. Aldwyn's Abbey, much older. Near the ruined bell, half buried beneath fallen leaves, Matthew noticed a weathered stone plaque. Most of the inscription had disappeared. Only a few words remained readable. Here stood, "The House of Listeners." The rest had been worn away by centuries of rain. Matthew looked back toward the distant abbey, then toward the forgotten ruins hidden among the trees. A thought quietly formed in his mind. Perhaps St. Aldwyn's never was the first home of the morning bell. Perhaps it inherited something much older, something whose true beginning had already been forgotten long before the first monks ever climbed these mountains. As the wind gently rang the little bronze bell once more, Matthew realized the mystery was growing larger than he had ever imagined. The Abbey had preserved the tradition, but somewhere in the silent ruins before him, the tradition had begun.
The ruins stayed in Brother Matthew's thoughts long after he returned to the Abbey, even while helping prepare the evening meal, even while copying faded manuscripts by candlelight. His mind kept returning to the small bronze bell hidden beneath the cedar trees. The inscription, "The House of Listeners." If those words were true, then St. Aldwyn's Abbey had inherited something far older than anyone had imagined. The following morning, Abbot Nicholas gathered a small group before sunrise. Only 6 people would return to the ruins: Brother Matthew, Brother Cedric, Brother Gabriel, Brother Thomas, a local muscle mason named William, and Elias, the elderly mapmaker who had unexpectedly returned to the monastery only 2 days earlier. When Matthew asked why he had come back so soon, Elias simply smiled. Some roads have a habit of calling travelers twice. The forest looked completely different in daylight. The storm had washed the air clean. Sunlight filtered through the towering cedar branches, creating long golden beams across the moss-covered ground. Birds sang quietly overhead. Nothing about the place felt abandoned. If anything, it felt peacefully forgotten. When they reached the ruins, William immediately began studying the stonework. He ran his hands slowly across the weathered blocks. Then he stepped back. This wasn't a monastery. Brother Matthew surprised. No? William shook his head. The walls are too low, the foundations too wide. There were no sleeping quarters, no kitchen, no chapel. Brother Cedric quietly asked, "What do you think it was?" The stonemason smiled. "A meeting place." They spent hours carefully clearing fallen branches and loose stones. Little by little, the shape of the ancient structure emerged. It formed a perfect circle, almost exactly the same size as the hidden chamber beneath the abbey. At its center stood the small bronze bell. Unlike the great abbey bell, this one showed no sign of decoration, no carved crosses, no royal seal, only 12 tiny circles engraved around its base. Matthew gently touched the cool bronze. It barely moved, yet somehow it still rang with remarkable clarity whenever the wind passed through the ruins. Near midday, Elias called everyone over. "I've found something." Beneath several flat stones lay a narrow stone box sealed with a heavy limestone lid. Unlike a treasure chest, it wasn't locked, only hidden. Together, they carefully lifted the cover. Inside rested several rolled parchments wrapped in layers of waxed cloth. Despite their age, they remained almost perfectly preserved. Brother Cedric's hands trembled slightly. "We should read them at the Abbey." Elias smiled. "I think we should read the first one here." Matthew carefully unrolled the smallest parchment. The ink had faded to a soft brown, yet every word remained readable. "To those who gather after us." He paused. The familiar style reminded him of the letter found beneath the monastery. "If this place has fallen into ruin, do not rebuild it." William frowned. "Why not?" Matthew continued reading. "Stone is never the purpose. People are." Silence settled over the circle. The letter explained that the House of Listeners had never belonged to one religion, or one kingdom, or one family. Travelers from many different lands had once met there. Scholars, monks, builders, teachers, healers, map-makers. Whenever war threatened books, whenever fire destroyed libraries, whenever kingdoms collapsed, someone carried copies to the mountain, not to hide forever, to protect until peace returned. Brother Gabriel quietly whispered, "So this place wasn't secret because people feared others." Matthew nodded. "It was secret because knowledge needed time." As the afternoon sun began lowering behind the trees, Brother Thomas noticed shallow carvings circling the outer wall. One by one, they cleaned away centuries of moss. There were names, dozens of them, not written in Latin alone. Some appeared in Greek, others in Old French, a few in languages none of them recognized. Elias smiled warmly. People from everywhere. William slowly counted them. 12. Again. Always 12. 12 bells, 12 chairs, 12 circles, 12 names. The number appeared everywhere. Before leaving, Matthew walked alone around the quiet ruins once last time. The wind gently moved through the cedar branches. The small bronze bell rang softly above him. For the first time, he didn't hear mystery, he heard welcome. The sound no longer felt strange, it felt familiar, almost comforting, as though every generation that had protected this place had left behind a small greeting for those who came after them. That evening, the brothers carefully carried the stone box back to St. Aldwyn's Abbey. Inside the library, they unrolled the remaining parchments. Most contained lists of books that had once passed through the House of Listeners. Others recorded the names of travelers who had protected them. Then, Brother Cedric quietly unfolded the final parchment. Unlike the others,
It wasn't a letter. It was a map, a remarkably detailed map. Not of kingdoms, not of trade routes, but of monasteries, abbeys, libraries, and quiet places scattered across Europe, each marked with the same familiar symbol, a single bell surrounded by 12 smaller bells. Matthew stared silently at the map. St. Aldwyn's was only one point among many. Dozens of others stretched across mountains, valleys, forests, and distant coastlines. The Abbey had never stood alone. It had always belonged to something much larger. Brother Gabriel looked at Matthew and smiled. It seems our story isn't only about one bell anymore. Matthew slowly nodded. No, it's about every place where someone quietly chose to remember. Outside, dawn was still many hours away. The great bell tower stood peacefully against the starlit sky. Tomorrow morning, the bell would ring once again, not only for St. Aldwyn's Abbey, but perhaps for every forgotten listener who had ever answered its call.
The first light of spring arrived quietly over the mountains. Golden sunlight slipped through the cedar branches, warming the old stone walls of St. Aldwyn's Abbey after another long winter. Birds returned to the valley. Wildflowers pushed through the earth beside forgotten footpaths, and the stream below the monastery sparkled beneath the morning sky. Everything felt peaceful, as though the mountain itself had finally exhaled. Yet beneath that quiet landscape, Brother Matthew knew the story was no longer simply about an abbey. It had become a story about people. People who had spent centuries protecting knowledge without expecting anyone to remember their names. Weeks passed. The brothers carefully organized every manuscript from the hidden chamber. Brother Cedric created a new catalog unlike any the Abbey had ever owned, not by date, not by kingdom, not by language. Instead, he arranged the books according to the journeys they had taken. Each manuscript carried a small note describing how it had reached St. Aldwyn's. Carried across the mountains by two sisters, saved from a monastery fire during the winter of 1184, protected beneath a miller's floorboards for 30 years. Matthew smiled every time he read those simple lines. History suddenly felt wonderfully human, not made by kings alone, but by ordinary people making quiet choices. One warm afternoon, the villagers gathered for the annual spring festival. Children laughed in the fields below the abbey. Musicians played wooden flutes beside long tables filled with fresh bread, cheese, apples, and honey. It was a tradition older than anyone could remember. Toward evening, the village elder approached Abbot Nicholas. He carried a small wooden chest wrapped in linen. "My family has kept this for generations." The abbot looked surprised. "What is it?" "We were told that if the Abbey of the Bell ever proved worthy, we should finally return it." The old man gently opened the lid. Inside rested dozens of folded letters, each written by travelers who had once found shelter at St. Aldwyn's. Some thanked them for food. Others thanked them for protecting books. A few simply expressed gratitude for kindness shown on difficult journeys. The oldest letter was nearly 300 years old. Brother Matthew spent the evening reading them beside the library fireplace. One message stayed with him. It had been written by an unknown teacher many generations earlier. If these books survive,
It will be because good people believed strangers deserved to inherit the truth. Matthew quietly folded the letter. It was perhaps the simplest explanation he had heard, and perhaps the truest. A few days later, Elias prepared to leave once again. The old mapmaker tightened the straps on his horse before handing Matthew one final gift. It wasn't a map or a compass, only a blank notebook bound in dark leather. Matthew looked puzzled. There are no pages written inside. Elias smiled warmly. Exactly. What am I supposed to write? The old traveler looked toward the bell tower. What happens next? That answer stayed with Matthew long after Elias disappeared down the mountain road. For weeks, the blank notebook remained untouched on his desk. Then one quiet evening, just after the morning bell had echoed across the valley, he finally opened it. He dipped his quill into fresh ink. On the first page he wrote, "The story continues." Not "the story ends," because now he understood something the earlier keepers had always known. History was never finished. Every generation added another page. Years slowly passed. Brother Thomas eventually grew too old to climb the bell tower. One peaceful spring morning, he handed the rope to Matthew. "I think it's your turn." Matthew accepted it quietly. The old monk smiled. "For years you wondered who rang the bell." Matthew laughed softly. "I remember. And now? I've realized something." Thomas waited. Matthew gently placed his hand on the thick rope. It was never about who pulled it. It was about why. The next morning, before sunrise, Matthew climbed the worn stone steps alone. The valley below remained wrapped in silver mist. The forest stretched endlessly toward distant mountains. He rested both hands upon the ancient rope, closed his eyes, and gently rang the bell. One clear note rolled across the hills exactly as it had for centuries. Farmers awoke. Bakers lit their ovens. Children turned beneath warm blankets. Travelers paused on distant roads. Life quietly began once more. No one can say with certainty whether St. Aldwyn's Abbey ever truly existed. No historian has uncovered a document that proves every part of this story, and perhaps that is perfectly fitting. Across Europe, there are real monasteries hidden in forests, mountain valleys, and lonely hillsides. Many contain libraries filled with manuscripts that survived wars, fires, invasions, and the passing of centuries. Some owe their existence not to famous rulers, but to unnamed monks, wandering scholars, patient librarians, village families, and ordinary travelers who quietly chose to preserve what others might have forgotten. This story was inspired by that remarkable tradition, not by one specific abbey, but by countless real places where history survived because someone cared enough to protect it. Perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. Not how one bell rang before dawn, but how kindness, patience, and memory can still echo across hundreds of years. As evening settles gently over the mountains once more, the old bell waits silently in its tower. Tomorrow, before the first light touches the cedar trees, it will ring again, just once, as it always has. A quiet reminder that while stone walls may crumble and names may fade, the stories we choose to remember can still travel farther than any bell ever could. The end.